he says, we come to terms with the question of existence always only through existence itself. We shall call this kind of understanding of itself existential understanding. The question of existence is an ontic affair of Dasein. So if you want to make an analogy, what he's saying is ontic is existential, as ontological is the existential. It's confusing because outside of Heidegger, when we say existential, we're referring to people like Kierkegaard or Sartre or whatever, where that distinction is not so pedantically made as he's making it. But I would say that the existential AL, as we normally spell it, but in Heidegger's specialized meaning, relates to what he refers to then as the theoretical transparency of the ontological structure of existence. So when we're talking about the theoretical ontological structure of existence, we're talking about what he refers to as the existential AL.
Okay.
Is that?
Yes, that really helps. And then just quickly, I started to ask Joan, and then the waiter came, and she said something about potentiality having some connection with EL. Does that make sense?
This may be a translation question. I don't know. Potentiality or a possibility, maybe.
Yes.
So Dasein's existence, I would say, for Heidegger on every level is a question of, I don't know whether the right word is going to be, realizing its potentiality or its possibilities, but it's more complicated than that, because one of the points I want to stress today is that the real issue for him, after describing this complicated situation, the real issue for him is whether whether Dasein is its possibility authentically or inauthentically. All right. So in other words, for example, in today's assignment, he speaks when he's speaking of the they and being, as it were, lost in the they and lost in everydayness, in effect, where we do not have an explicit understanding of our being there, when we're there in only an implicit way in terms of the structure of it. The issue for him is not, in other words, and in that context, when I'm lost in everydayness, then the true subject of Dasein is the they, okay, which takes on, I don't know whether you noticed it, and if we get to it in the text, I will try and stress it, but I'll anticipate it. He calls it an ens realissimum, which, by the way, would be a kind of medieval term for God, right? The most real being. But the they takes on that kind of godlike dominance over Dasein when Dasein is not explicitly aware of its itself, of its authentic. That's what I'm trying to get at, yeah. Right? But the point I'm trying to make is that the dominance by the they. This is part of the critique of Heidegger. The dominance of the they when Dasein is lost in everydayness. What's objectionable to Heidegger about that is not the dominance, right? Because there is a sense in which, going back to something we touched on last time, Dasein belongs to being, all right? And in some sense, even though it is abandoned by beings, we'll see in the Beiträge, nevertheless, that abandonment of being is a kind of negative experience of its belonging to being, all right? And what I want to say is, in a certain way, being dominated by being, or even in its authentic mode, Dasein is somehow or other in submission to being, in submission to, you might say, its own worldliness, right? So that notion. So the question, right? So when you get to somebody like Sartre, the critique, one level of the critique of Heidegger is that Heidegger doesn't have a serious notion of freedom, in the sense in which Sartre, of course, has it in spades, right? And then, I don't like to step outside the text, but if you step outside the text and look at the certainly questionable behavior of Heidegger in Nazi Germany, you could perhaps relate that question. You could relate the fact that Heidegger doesn't get beyond the question of authentic and inauthentic submission. You say submission is okay by him in some sense, right? In that sense, a kind of dependency on the other, you see, which we touched on in a theological frame of reference last time, right? When I was saying that in the thinking now occurring, the theological analog, so to speak, to being itself would be omnipotence, as I develop it in the, especially as I develop in the ethics and morality seminars, where I make the point, even over against my otherwise good friend Kierkegaard, that omnipotence in the thinking now occurring absolutely cuts loose the creation. All right, there's an absolute break in the thinking now occurring that doesn't occur even in Kierkegaard's rendition of omnipotence, which I quote in I think it's one of the morality. I don't know if it's a Badiou or the Agamben thing, but anyway, Kierkegaard speaks in his journals about omnipotence withdrawing from the creature, and that withdrawal from the creature for Kierkegaard means the other side of that, or the positive of that withdrawal of omnipotence, is the making the creature independent. Right? The problem is, in the context of thinking now occurring, is that withdrawal just goes on indefinitely. Right? In other words, there's never an absolute break with the creature, and therefore the independence of the creature is not, as it would be characterized in Foundation, in the thinking now occurring generally, it is not an absolute independence. All right? So I'm just going back to that because it's a little more accessible to us. But the question of submission to another, whether it be the world or the being of the world or whatever, is a irreducible element in Heidegger's understanding.
Does it make sense to ask whether it is natural and or necessary for Heidegger, that dependence?
Well, it depends what you mean by the word. Natural is a suspect word here.
Yeah.
So natural has to do with the world of objective presence, nature.
Yeah.
So it depends what you mean by natural. Say it again.
Well, necessary, as a necessary something of design.
Yeah, I'd say, I think, again, necessary, again, having to put the same kind of qualification on all of these terms, that they're not necessary in a simply metaphysical sense, okay?
Yes.
So, but necessary in the sense that, I think it relates to the idea of thrownness, that when we come upon ourselves already consigned to ourselves as Dasein in a world that in some sense, we touched on it last time in the first assignment where he says that Dasein is its past. That pastness, which comes up again, I think, in today's assignment in the form of his reference in one of the footnotes to Aristotle's ta tienenai, Aristotle's multi-word definition of essence, the what it was to be, literally, okay? And Heidegger, again there, if we get to that footnote, is emphasizing the pastness, or the perfect tenseness, as he puts it, of, he says that the Greek has no perfect, and so Aristotle uses what is really the imperfect ein, what it was to be, right? But it's, again, the notion for Aristotle. Now, of course, how you read that, the way Heidegger reads it, is not exactly the way it's read in Novitas Mundi, okay? Novitas Mundi attributes the pastness of, in the multi-word definition of essence, what it was to be in Aristotle. The Novitas Mundi understands that to refer to the difference between the identity of the knower and the known, which is in the immediacy of what Heidegger does recognize as the perceptive nature of Greek intellect. That is, Greek knowing is intellectual perception. I was emphasizing the term eistasis, which is a little bit risky, but I'm willing to, hell, it's too late in the game now to avoid risk. And I want to go over that. It comes up again in today's assignment. Heidegger recognizes that Greek, Jim raised this a couple of classes ago when he looked at the subtitle of Novitas Mundi and said, what do you mean perception of being? The perception of the history of being, right? A perception there in that sense of a direct vision, perception, vision of the intellectual object. For the Greeks, that's what to know was. When I say the Greeks, I have to be careful. For Aristotle and Plato, the classical Greek philosophers, to know was to perceive intellectually on the analogy to sensible perception, right? Now, where was I going with that? What did you just ask me?
Questions around necessity.
Oh, necessity. Yeah. Okay, so the necessity, if necessity is the right term in Heidegger, it's related to the notion of the already being there of the world. In other words, in that sense, there's no getting outside of our being. And in that sense, our experience of the worldliness of the world is, as it were, necessary in the sense that it, I can't say predates exactly, you see, but it is, his language, it's prior to, you say, it is before. That's why he brings up the Aristotelian essence, that the priority that he's talking about here would, in his sense of the word, be a ontological priority, where ontological, which is his synthesis of the ontic and the ontological, that otherwise, by my analogy now, can be related to Kierkegaard and Husserl, which will relate to the analysis in the last 3 chapters of Novitas Mundi. In his synthesis of the ontic and the ontological, in other words, when he makes the distinction between the existential, to go back to your first question, and the existential, he wants to bring them together. He wants to, the project here, the work at hand is to investigate, the inquiry is into the existential structures of our existential experience. So he doesn't want to keep them apart, and I think that's part of his critique of Husserl, which comes up again. We have a couple places in today's assignment, especially where he's always a little careful, but where he's pointing at what his dissatisfaction with Husserl might be understood to be, or his wanting to go further, or more deeply, or do a more fundamental analysis than Husserl does. Husserl remains in a kind of Cartesian mode. One of Husserl's early, very important little books is called Cartesian Meditations, right? And so to put it pretty simply, Husserl's understanding of phenomenology is a clarification, in effect, of the Cartesian enterprise, right? And so he wants to, as it were, abstract, that is, to bracket the question of the existence or the substantiality of the world, and focus on the essence of world in general, as Husserl would put it, so that what one comes up with is the essence of world in general, bracketing the question of the existence of this world. Now, so we try. I think one of the things that I want to do personally here, one of the things that I'm always thinking about, which is not easy to do with Heidegger, because precisely he's absenting himself from the philosophical tradition in some important way, right? Certainly from the metaphysical tradition, right? So, but I want to locate him, as it were, and he, of course, himself wants to locate himself vis-a-vis the history of philosophy. But I want to locate him in such a way that we can understand ourselves beyond him, and that's not easy to do, right? But in that respect, it's as if he is. It goes back to my idea of synthesizing the ontic and the ontological, the existential and the existential, not being content to allow them to stay apart. In that sense, he's a kind of post-metaphysical Hegel. You see, he has an objection to Husserl that's analogous to Hegel's objection to Kant, to the continuing reflective, abstractive mode that Kant is in from Hegel's point of view. Analogously, Husserl makes a distinction that he doesn't quite ever resolve between the empirical ego and the transcendental ego, okay? And just as Kant makes a distinction between a transcendental idealism and what for Kant is an empirical realism, all of those kinds of distinctions, in a sense, Heidegger wants to get beyond or to get underneath them. I guess might be a better way of understanding what he's really trying to do, right? So I was about to say he's, in critique of Husserl, it's as if he were going, if he could, this is misleading, but then I want to say it so I can take it back. it's as if he were going back in a way at least analogous to Kierkegaard, you see, to that substantial world, right, that Husserl brackets, or the substantiality of which substantial world Husserl brackets in order to do his phenomenology. Heidegger wants to deal with the substantial world, right? And I think if you read carefully today's assignment, you'll see what I'm trying to articulate here in Heidegger's own terms somewhere in here. He wants to talk about the substantial world, the substance of the world, but the substance of the world now is not a substance beyond or behind appearances, you see. And in fact, he says that the substance of the world is existence. That substance in his understanding of phenomenology is existence, but existence now is not, in a kind of Kantian Husserlian sense, something that is behind the world of appearances or the world of phenomenon, which is another distinction which we want to get to briefly, and we want to move on from it later on. But because it gets, I don't know whether confusing is the right word, but it gets complicated because when Heidegger speaks of Kant's understanding of appearance, he in effect allows that it satisfies Kant's, as far up to a certain point, it satisfies Heidegger's notion of the phenomenon, of the phenomenal, right? That is, it only does so up to a certain point because, in other words, the empirical intuition of Kant is phenomenal in the Heideggerian sense. But un-Heideggerian in Kant is that behind the empirical intuition, what Kant actually calls the substantia phenomenon, right? The substantial or the phenomenal substance, okay? Behind that for Kant is a noumenal world, you see. There is a being and which is substance behind the world that we otherwise constitute through our transcendental consciousness in Kant, right? There's no such thing in Heidegger, right? So, in other words, you had asked the question walking down the street last time, or you not asked the question, but you pointed to the discussion around page 30, where he speaks of veritas transcendentalis, right? Transcendental truth, phenomenological. Maybe we should take a look at that.
Bottom of 33.
Yeah, kill a couple of birds with one stone here if we can. In the bottom of our page 33, Heidegger's 38, about 10 lines, 5 or 6, 7, 8 lines down, and Heidegger's 38, our 33. New paragraph. As the fundamental theme of philosophy, being is not a genus of beings, yet it pertains to every being. Its universality must be sought in a higher sphere. Being and its structure transcend every being and every possible existent determination of a being. Being is the transcendence pure and simple. That which transcends purely and simply. So it's not a genus, because I think I was saying last time, anticipating this discussion in effect, that it's, how can I put it? There's not just one genus, right? So it's not a genus means it's not a particular general. So a general in a certain sense is a transcendence to its species, you see, but it's not purely and simply transcendence, right? It is as genus, it's transcendence, as it were. The language is impossible here, right? Because forget translating. If you don't, whether you translate it or not, it's impossible, okay? Because what he's talking about here in medieval terms is a transcendental, and that's why he's able to, after saying it's a transcendence, right? If you translate it transcendence as Latin, it's a participle. It's the nominative of the participle. The adjective transcendentis is where we get the T in our word transcendent. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at is a transcendence, pure and simple, which being is the equivalent in some modified sense now in Heidegger. It's analogous to the way in which in medieval thought being is a transcendental, which is beyond the genera. Okay, so he's just going back and forth here between a transcendence, pure and simple. Being is such a is so universal or so generally where it's at, if I can put it that way. All right, it is so much so, purely and simply so, that it is not a genus, you see, and it is, so he says, the transcendence, on page 34 at the top, the transcendence of the being of Dasein is a distinctive one, since in it lies the possibility and necessity of the most radical individuation. Let me read the next sentence too, just to close off these terminology problems. Every disclosure of being as the transcendence is transcendental knowledge. Phenomenological truth, disclosedness of being, is veritas transcendentalis. This distinctive one that is the transcendence of the being of Dasein is the possibility and necessity of the most radical individuation. Now here's a point of contact with the thinking now occurring, all right? I speak in the thinking now occurring of absolute particularity. It's not exactly the same thing for lots of reasons, right? Because there is that continuing difference between the term particular and the term individual, even though, again, in English, we use them often interchangeably, right? But particular and individual, logically speaking, are two different things. The individual is the synthesis of the universal and the particular. If I speak of an absolute particularity, I've done something analogous to what Heidegger does when he cuts off the movement from the universal through the particular to the individual. The thinking now occurring, as it were, I'm not speaking literally now, but I'm just trying to communicate here a little bit, cuts off the movement. This fits. Right in the middle. Right at the particular moment. That is, in other words, it absolutely cuts it off in the middle. Absolute particularity, in that sense, you see, doesn't begin after the universal in the thinking now occurring, nor before individuality. All right, it's where it's at altogether. Now that requires further parsing, which I'm not going to go into now because we want to go back to Heidegger. Right. So, but what I'm getting at is that in the thinking now occurring, if you read Novitas Mundi, a term that's used there, which is not really logically developed over and over again in the appendices, is the transcendental essence of existence, right? And because it's put in a at least a philosophically theological as well as a more pointedly theological context, depending on how you read the text, many people, first of all, not many people have read the book, but of the very few people who have read Novitas Mundi, many of those very few have immediately grasped that somehow or other what we're talking about there is the incarnation, even though that language is very abstract. The transcendental essence of existence, you could say, is, in the context of Novitas Mundi, it is Jesus, it is Jesus Christ, or it is Christ, qua conception, qua thought, okay? And it's only as I go along, and probably only in a very explicit way, I surprise myself in the morality seminar, where I actually, by the way, when I'm dealing with Agamben's references to medieval thought and so forth, and to Thomas and so forth, that I'm a little more technically explicit about how that phrase should be understood. That the transcendental essence of existence, putting it ontologically and logically, all right, is, as it were, the I want to say it's the absolute specification. I want to say something like this. I'm not sure this is technically right, but it's as if it's the absolute specification of the transcendental. In other words, it's the denial in the thinking now occurring that there is not only it's the denial that, and this is relevant to this question that appears in 33 and 34 of Heidegger. The thinking now occurring is saying not only, as Aristotle said, as Thomas said, and as Heidegger is in the process of saying here on this page, it's thinking now occurring wants to say not only is being not a genus, right? They're all saying that in different ways. The thinking now occurring, it wants to say there ain't no genus. There's There is no genus, period. Okay? That there is, as it were, that species are absolutely immediate. And if species, speaking logically, not theologically, the absolute immediacy of absolutely the absolute immediacy of actually existing species. That would be technically correct. The absolute immediacy of actually existing species is what the thinking now occurring thinks. Okay, and so when Heidegger says here, and so here we have a point of, I would say, profound contact and departure with Heidegger here. Heidegger is anticipating what I've just tried to articulate technically correctly, the thinking now occurring thinking. Can I do it again? The
absolute immediacy of
actually existing species or / particulars. Do you say? Thinking that Heidegger approaches that, as it were, okay, when he says that the transcendence of the being that he's talking about, this transcendence pure and simple, okay, is distinctive, since in it lies the possibility and necessity of the most radical individuation. Right, the most radical individuation is where he's at. Okay, and speaking of necessity, he helps us out here. Right, possibility and necessity. Possibility and necessity. If I have to have a framework here. Put that in the Kantian framework. Possibility and necessity are what? They are the beginning and end of Kant's category class having to do with modality. Okay, so that fourth classification of categories. The first one is possibility, the second one is existence, and the third one is necessity. Okay, and so where is Heidegger? Put it in Kantian terms, he's also in some sense in the middle. The question is he absolutely in the middle? All right, and I would say no, he's not absolutely in the middle, because he's retentive and protentive, to borrow some language he likes to use about temporality. Right, he's retentive of the reference back. Intrinsically a reference back to the first beginning, and he is protentive, he's, as it were, future-oriented, again in a fundamental way, because his being in the middle, which he is, right, is nevertheless a being in the middle which comes to, if I generalize what he said about Dasein here in terms of the Beiträge, being in the middle comes to it out of its future. Do you say? So, is he in the middle? Yes. Is the thinking now occurring in the middle? Yes. Are they both interested in some sort of, in Heidegger's terms, not in the thinking now occurring terms, but analogously, some sort of radical, now, individuation, do you see? Or absolute immediacy of the actually existing species? You see the analogy between those two ideas, and they both are middling, in the most positive sense of the word, they're both middling ways to be, okay? But despite that analogy with Heidegger, there's that difference. So let me stop there because I see a hand.
Before we unpack the individuation, which I think we just did, the transcendence, it strikes me as kind of a strange departure from the overall interest of both the introduction and this first kind of section, where why is now being transcendence, and well, I think you were getting at it with is there a medieval use of this that I'm not used to? Because why? I mean, I know we're trying to get beyond it being a genus. That makes sense to me.
Being is not a genus, but that's not original with Heidegger.
Right.
Okay. I mean, that particular statement.
So it makes sense to me for Heidegger why being should not be a genus.
Okay.
It's too limited in a way.
Yeah. Okay.
But why emphasize the transcendence when so much effort has been put into showing how being is existence and how being is finite? So why now the language of transcendence? Is it purely?
Well, look at the asterisk note at the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
So he anticipates your objection. He said, of course, not transcendence, despite the fact that he's used the term in the text.
Right.
Despite every metaphysical resonance,
Right.
Scholastic and Greek Platonic koinon. Rather, transcendence, it is transcendence, but as ecstatic, temporal, or ecstatic temporality. He's got temporality there, all right? But horizon, being has thought beyond beings. However, transcendence from the truth of being, the event. So it's an ecstatic temporality. It is now again. We got this language problem. It's as it were a distancing. Actually, the distancing, however, as we see in today's assignment, is really a de-distancing. All right, okay, but de-distancing or distancing, it is some kind of being apart from, being beyond the beings, but not transcendent in the sense in which, let's say, in a medieval context, you might think that God is transcendent to the world in the sense of outside of the world. Right. You say, if Dasein is outside of the world, it is so within the world. Okay, and I think that's what the ecstatic temporality is. In other words, it's outside of the world, not in any metaphysical or absolute sense, as if it could be apart from the world. Do you see? But that goes back to the meaning. So the non-metaphysical meaning of necessity and possibility, the non-metaphysical meaning of individuality in Heidegger. Do you see? The post. What I want to say, the post metaphysical understanding of the synthesis of possibility and necessity. The post-metaphysical understanding of transcendence, okay, is a being. It's a being outside of the world, within the world. It's being in the world ecstatically, okay, and that ecstatic temporality of the being within the world corresponds to, again, and cannot be understood apart from what we mentioned last time, that being itself is temporal. Okay, so something else I was saying, going back to the yes and no of Kant and Heidegger, right? In other words, Heidegger, and Husserl, right? See, Heidegger, like Kant, is interested in the phenomenal substance or substantial phenomenality. So the substantia phenomenon of Kant resonates with Heidegger in a way that it doesn't with Husserl. That Husserl brackets it, but that substantial, that substance which is existence, which is phenomenal, okay, is not understood metaphysically as something behind which there's a noumenal being. All right, so the substantial being of the world not necessarily discloses itself, and it discloses itself in the clearing, the openness, which Dasein is for that disclosure. All right, but Dasein is not for that disclosure in any kind of simple, mechanically or ontologically necessary way, all right? Because otherwise it would not be possible for it to bury over and obscure, do you see, the being of the world. So what I'm trying to get at is it's one way of understanding it is that and this is very Hegelian, by the way. This is also post-Hegelian. I mean, Heidegger wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for Hegel, because remember, Hegel does metaphysics is much easier than this. Hegel looks at Kant and he says, "You got a world of appearance, and I got a real world, or I got a world of phenomena, and I got a world of noumena." Let's say appearance and substance, appearance of reality. And Hegel is the guy who says they're identical. They are abstract. They are abstractions from the concrete identity. Substance appears would be a way of understanding what Hegel is saying. Substance actually appears. Okay. I phrased it one time in here. I can't remember what class it was, but I tried to point out that even though this is the dialectic in Hegel, which is very important because it's working here subliminally in Heidegger, that when substance appears in Hegel, it's not any kind of positive, straightforward. It can't be in Hegel, right? It can't be a positive, straightforward, once for all statement. Okay. Ontologically, what appears is what is absent, and it appears as absent. Okay. Maybe in Heideggerian terms, what does not show itself in appearance, as opposed to the basic distinction that Heidegger makes in last time's assignment between the phenomenon is what shows itself, and the appearance is what, in appearing, does not show itself, withholds itself in some sense, right? What Hegel is saying is that, and this may be where Heidegger's drawing on, in a way, that from which he's drawing in order to make his distinctions. What Hegel is saying is that what appears in the Kantian sense is noumenal, that is, it is what doesn't reveal itself, reveals itself as such, as not revealing itself in the appearances. And and that's what gets the dialectic going in Hegel. You understand? In other words, if what doesn't show itself just showed itself in appearance as unqualifiedly, then there'd be no need to go on to the next step. Okay? So what shows itself to Hegel in the appearance, despite what Kant says, is what does not show itself, but it shows itself as not showing itself, and therefore it necessitates, speaking of necessity, it necessitates the dialectic, all right? It's right there, in the beginning, the dialectic is necessitated, right? But since in Heidegger there's nothing behind appearances, you see? There's nothing, there's no noumenal, right? There's nothing, okay. That the necessity of the necessity of moving on to the ideal moment, to go back to a question that you raised last time on another level. I don't know whether I answered it this way. I thought I might have. In other words, this is not idealism, not only because we're not dealing with the absolute idea and the dialectical dynamic of its coming to absolute self-knowledge in the philosophy of mind of Hegel, right? Yes, it's not idealism in that sense, for sure, but it's not idealism already because it doesn't go on to the second moment, which in other sense of the word for Hegel is the ideal moment. The world over against the universal, the particular world over against the universal, has only an ideal existence. That is, it's there to be consumed, do you see, in the process of the absolute self-realization of the idea, right? In the process which results ultimately in what is there to begin with, the absolute individual, which is the divine idea.
So for Heidegger, it's never not been realized.
Well, for Heidegger, we don't move on to that second step, because what we have in the world of appearance, properly understood now, understood phenomenally, okay? What we have in time and space, do you see? Time and space would relate in Kantian terms to what Kant would call the transcendental schema. Schema is a word that plays here in the thinking now occurring in a number of different ways, right? But in Kantian terms, the transcendental schema's function, in some sense, the temporal spatial world is a kind of synthesis, is understood constructively as a synthesis of the sensational, the sensible, intuitive, the transcendental aesthetic, and the transcendental analytic or transcendental logic, the realm of concept, of thought, of understanding, right? So my actual experience is the synthesis of the sensible and the conceptual, of understanding and sensibility in Kant. That synthetic moment takes place in terms of the temporal spatial world in Kant, as opposed to the noumenal world, the substantial world. It takes place in the context of our experience, which we constitute, I think we said, I don't know which course it was, we pointed out that Kant says in the critique that his response to Hume's skepticism is that there's no problem as long as we recognize that we are the authors or the creators of our own experience. But our experience is limited to time and space. Our experience is not experience of the substance, it's the experience, temporal spatial experience, we constitute or construct or author or create our temporal spatial experience of the world, and in that sense it's a schematic, synthetic construction, you see, the elements of which are thought and sensibility, understanding and sensibility, or concept and percept, if I put it in terms that James and Peirce would understand, simply put. Okay. So I'm going to come back to Heidegger now. I'm trying to get back to Heidegger, right? That temporal spatial schema, distinguished from substance in Kant, is where that's substantial for Heidegger, right? But it's not substantial in a metaphysical sense. Do you see? In other words, the physical is the temporal spatial, if we understand that by the physical, right, is substantial. The substantial being of inner worldly things is there to be disclosed insofar as Dasein becomes explicitly aware of itself as being in the world. And in being explicitly aware of itself as being in the world, then it becomes explicitly aware of itself as ecstatic temporality, right? Explicitly aware of itself as, see, it's interesting. It's not my fault. Being in the world. So I mean, this has become a cliche. Dasein is being in the world. Being there is being in the world. But wait a minute, hold it. What's the difference between the being in the phrase being in the world and the being, the meaning of which we're in search of? Did you say? Okay. Well, there can't be any kind of difference between them that would be metaphysical. Do you say? So when we talk about the belonging to Dasein belongs to being, that at first glance seems to be a kind of alienating idea, but then again, in belonging to being and becoming explicitly aware of its belonging to being, it comes into its own, right? It realizes its own most being is to belong to being. So there is as he says in today's language, in the language of today's reading, Dasein is self-referential, self-referring. Do you say? And in terms of its relationship to things in the world, it is circumspectively self-referring. But what I'm trying to get at is it's self-referring. So we go back to this question of consciousness and self-consciousness and so on. One of the things I was trying to say last time is that, yes, he prescinds from consciousness, but he doesn't really prescind from self and self-relation or self-referral. Do you say? So this self-reference is constitutionally what Dasein is all about, and it's belonging to being, it's being related to being in whatever kind of non-metaphysical way that is necessary. That it is I don't want to say a given in the sense of an arbitrary given, right? But that it is there to begin with in the experience of thrownness, or in the ontological structure of being thrown, in whatever way I belong to being as an individual Dasein, I suppose you could say that. Again, the language is problematic. In whatever way I belong to being is not an alternative to my being authentically, being Eigentlichen.
Eigentlichkeit.
Well, okay, that was the noun. Okay, it's not an alternative to my own most being. Belonging to being and my own most being are within this. I want to say within this ecstatic transcendence, within this opening, within this clearing. All right, Dasein is constitutionally. Are, I don't want to say necessarily related. They are related, right? That they always already have been. I am always already related to the being of beings, in being there. or in being there. I was going to say in being here, but as he says today, being here, Dasein is first there, right? In other words, I get to the here, right? Because initially, on every level, I'm lost. Initially, I'm not, right? In other words, we haven't gotten to it yet, but it's hinted at the angst question, right? In other words, how does Dasein? What is the occasion for Dasein being liberated from its lostness, coming to itself, right? It's going to be angst, okay? But initially I'm not in that position. Initially I'm lost. Initially I haven't come to myself. Initially the subject of the Dasein that I am is taken over by, as it were, the they. All right. In other words, So there's an irreducible tension, I want to say, an irreducible, whatever the right word for that is. If it were metaphysics, it would be a polarity. Right? In other words, we have here as a non-metaphysical, post-metaphysical self-other relationship. To say, with all the sharp edges taken off it, all the uncritically ontological notions that he categorizes as objective presence. To say, so yes, we're beyond objective presence in Heidegger, right? Or underneath it, I think, right? We're underneath objective presence, and in that sense, perhaps beyond it, because in going underneath it, we're going also back before the first beginning, we're going back to the point, actually in some sense you must say, right before the decision that was made at the beginning of Western philosophy, all right? And insofar as we're going under and back at the same time, as far as the vertical and the horizontal really converge here at this, as it were, point, in going deeper than it and going before it, we're now at a place, as it were, where there is the anticipation, fundamental, I want to say intrinsic or essential anticipation of a new beginning, of another beginning, of a second beginning, all right? Of a new, as it were, a new way of thinking, all right? Only we're fundamentally anticipating it in Heidegger, right? And therefore, now how can you do all of that? Well, because temporality now is not a timeline as in Kant, right? In other words, when I'm going back to the past in this sense, I'm not doing some impossible thing in terms of world time. It's not a time machine kind of going back, you see? But I can go back in a genuine, authentic sense, right? Because in coming to myself as authentic Dasein, right, I recognize this possibility of my being as I want to say, as remaining open, right? And I recognize as remaining open because I'm no longer under the illusion, as it were, that it isn't an open possibility, under which illusion I would be, insofar as I have been entangled in the tradition, in the history of philosophy. Right, and insofar as I have remained non-circumspectively involved in the history of philosophy, then of course I would have no idea, I would have no clue, as it were, that this possibility of another beginning is part of the authentic, my authentic relationship to being, something like that. Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to hand this to a German expert for a second. There's I've checked, thanks to Adam here, your text versus this text, and there is that footnote to being is the transcendence, pure and simple. What does that Schlechten? What does that mean?
Schlechten is could be translated as pure and simple.
Okay, so that's that's what that means, like
Yeah.
It's one word. I was trying to
in the same category.
Yeah. I also would like eventually, it's not for
Okay.
today because you're so far behind now.
Yeah, no, I'm
But,
going to jump right away. Go on.
But I would like to, since you raised the problem Heidegger had with, being dominated by the world of Nazism.
Or the problem that he didn't have. The problem that people have about his apparent ability to negotiate that world.
Right. And that, of course, is very current because of the Pope. And I don't know if you've read the latest article on him in the New Yorker, but
Right.
you should.
Okay. Well, I haven't, so maybe I will. Let's not. We can't go off like that. It's impossible. We have to catch up here. All right. Let's just stop off on 30, 39, and 40. We've anticipated this. The being whose analysis our task is always we ourselves.
Where are we?
I think I'm on page 39.
Right.
Okay. The being of this being is always mine. In the being of this being, it is related to its being. Let me say another thing, since I made this reference to Kant, which I think is not incidental here. There are many ways of, and it goes back to the question of the transcendental truth, that the truth of phenomenology is transcendental truth. He wants to make those terms interchangeable. I think that, and so you can define the transcendental in many different ways, but one way in which transcendental being, as opposed to transcendent being in a Kantian, Husserlian, and I think effectively Heideggerian tradition, one way transcendental would be distinguished from transcendent is that transcendent being in the metaphysical sense and in the Husserlian phenomenological sense, which remains, I guess you could say, a little bit too metaphysical for Heidegger's taste. The transcendent being is precisely that which is not related to itself in its own being, right? For which, right, transcendent being, in this sense of the word, as opposed to transcendental being, is that being which is not an issue for itself, right? The doorknob is not, the being of the doorknob is not a matter of concern to the doorknob, right? Okay, so that's one way in which we can distinguish what transcendental means in Kant, and analogously, it's operating here in Heidegger is what I want to say, right? In the transcendental realm in Kant is the realm of what Hegel will make absolutely clear, self-consciousness. You see, and Husserl plays off this idea, not in the uncritical way in which Kant accepts it, right? He critically plays off it, but he remains enough of a Cartesian, do you see, as to distinguish his phenomenological subjectivity as the phenomenological ego, or the transcendental ego in Husserl is distinguished from the transcendent object, and that transcendence of the object to the transcendental ego constitutes what intentionality is for Husserl, okay? So what I'm getting at is, even though we want to get down under even Husserl's continuing, if abstracted, dependence upon the Cartesian element, even though we want to do that, and that means, in the language we've been using, that means, in some sense, getting beyond consciousness, or again, down under, more fundamental analysis of our being in the world than consciousness restricts us to, you see? Or get to that more fundamental analysis of what it means to be in the world, which is, in fact, obscured by, covered over by, buried over by consciousness. Do you see? So in getting to that level, I said what? We're getting beyond in Heidegger consciousness, or under consciousness, or before consciousness in some sense, you see. Reminds us a little bit of Levinas. Not quite as back beyond as Levinas is, but back beyond consciousness. Where is that going to be, by the way? That's going to be the nothing. That's the point. In my analysis in Foundation, I do a lot of, at one point there in the second half of the book there, I do some stuff on Galileo and his notion of the circle and the point, the vanishing point, and bring in the Hebrew and all that exotic jazz, right? The fundamental simple point there is that in modern mathematics, as a reflection of modern consciousness, the point is zero dimension where zero means nothing, right? And so it's the vanishing point. It's right, and if you've read any of the stuff I've written on Levinas, Levinas is understood to be back beyond the point. It's less than nothing. By the way, it's a Kantian term that Kant uses in the Introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals that Levinas just ran with. He just stole it. I don't think I have yet come. I haven't done an exhaustive search, right? I don't think he ever mentions Kant in this connection, but Kant has already set it up for him, right? Not in a technical sense, of course. I don't want to take anything away from Levinas's profound originality as a thinker, but Kant pointed for Levinas to the fact that there is something less than nothing, and that people who resort to less than nothing, in a very casual sense, Kant says, they're not anti-reason, they're trying to do a critique of reason. Well, Levinas's whole work is starting being at the place which is less than nothing. Well, if that's pre-ontological, it's more radically so, you see, than the pre-ontological position that Heidegger is taking up. Heidegger's position is pre-ontological in the sense that this is a mathematical analogy now, or a geometric analogy. He's at the nothing point, right? In other words, he has gotten to that point which is still contained within the circle, do you see, which is nothing. In a way, it's the nothing of which the whole damn circle is composed, if you stop and think about it. Okay, in other words, all those points on the circumference of the circle, any one of them taken in isolation, in mathematical thinking, any one point taken in isolation ain't a line, and a line is the first dimension, right? So it's nothing. It's a very frightening thought, right? And of course, I'd rather do geometry than face the fear that I have of myself as being here or being there. Do you see that? Of course, I bury over the nothing by drawing the circle. You see? But when I think about it, the circle is made up of the nothing that's in the center of it. That's a frightening thought. Stop. I'm going to throw out my compass and my protractor and stuff. Forget it. I mean, this is right. This is a way of avoiding. You see, in other words, yes, Dasein is the disclosure of being in the world, but that disclosure of being in the world cannot be separated from nothing, from the nothing. Right? That's where the angst was going to come. When all of a sudden we're hit with that. Now, did you get anxious when I said that about the circle? You should have.
I was going to say.
So I can't have an authentic understanding of being, really, without. Speaking of transcendence, without transcendence to nothing, right? So it's not just transcendence to things that are objectively present. Do you see? Because the objective presence covers up. It's like the apparent, the appearance of points as if they were not nothings. Take on a kind of pseudo. Substantiality, as it were, you see. But every one of the points that composes that circle is nothing. It's nothing, right? If I'm going to have a genuine, authentic, I want to say genuine, but authentic is more authentic. If I want to have an authentic understanding of my experience of the world, of my experience of beings, you see, I can't ultimately come to that without the transcendence to nothing, right? And that's what. That's where he's ultimately, well, I don't know ultimately going, but that's where he's going in the first place. Okay, now what made me think of all of that? The being of this being, back on page 39, at the very beginning, is always mine. In the being of this being, it is related to its being. Now, of course, all right, so that's what I'm trying to say, is that's Heidegger's version of the transcendental being, right? That's why it's veritas transcendentalis, right? Because what we're concerned about here is the being of this being, which is mine, is always related to its being, and as I get to elaborate it, the way in which it's related to its being is in concern, and then more particularly in today's assignment, mood-wise or otherwise, in fear, right? So, but fear is just evidence, as it were, a manifestation of the more fundamental ontological, existential AL structure of my everyday experience is concerned. Okay. I want to say it's explicitly concerned when I am authentically being there, and it is, but there can be an inauthentic concern which takes the form of caring what others think, to put it in crude terms. When I worry about other, then your mother tell you don't worry about what other people think, right? Okay. So she was a Heideggerian. Okay. But the fact that she had to tell you that tells you, you see, that we are constitutionally prone. I guess that's the word I want to use. Prone. We're constitutionally prone, for the most part, and certainly to begin with, we're prone. What? To live outside of ourselves, I guess we would say in more, right? To live in the they, right?
That's what I meant
Yeah.
by natural.
Yeah.
constitutional.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But that's also a function of the fact that human beings are dependent for a huge amount of time, so they're absorbing what's in the world. They're
Right.
absorbing as part of who we think we are, what's being taken in from socialization, parents, schools, da 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 da. So
Okay, but yes, okay, except that ability, again, you've naturalized it a little bit. I mean, that's right, but that natural truth, that what, psychological, sociological truth,
what's the biological truth, actually?
and a biological, but all those all of those specific sciences which are rooted in specific or particular ontologies, okay, they're also a little bit misleading, because while that's true what you just said, the fact that that is able to be true needs to be understood more foundationally as, in turn, a function, as it were, of the very constitution of what it means to Dasein, to be in such a way that one is there. Okay. All right, so we're gonna catch up here. All right, and so on this same page, I think we've already noted it, but he uses the terms existence and essence there in the next paragraph, and again, it's a terminological thing. Essence here and existence, but he says, I think in the footnote, does he say it in the footnote, or he says it somewhere, maybe in the text. Existence, ontologically, existentia, about 5 lines down in that first paragraph, means objective presence, a kind of being which is essentially inappropriate to characterize the being which has the character of Dasein. We can avoid confusion by always using the interpretive expression objective presence, Vorhandenheit, for the term existentia, and reserving, in effect, existence in his sense of phenomenology, reserving that for being in the world, as opposed to being in a worldly being, as opposed to being a thing. So the who, what in metaphysical terms, again, he wants to part company with the language, but what we would normally think of as the person, or the empirical I, the empirical self, all of those things. When I set aside the term person, the term reality, the empirical I, the fundamentally phenomenological subject, in quotes. Notice he has to put quote marks around when he avoids the notion of subjectivity. It's something which I want to get to as a very general idea in a moment, which I think will be a helpful clue to understanding what's going on here. But in other words, we have these terms, some of which keep occurring, even to Heidegger. So the who of Dasein is some kind of a subject, but he wants to make clear it's not a subject in the Cartesian sense of the word, right? It's some kind of an I, but it's not a Cartesian I, or it's not the center of a subjectivity that distinguishes itself from a transcendent being. Right? I think that'd be a way of putting it. Okay. Okay.
Is this the first kind of formal appearance of the notion that essence is existence? This top.
Oh, well, I'm glad you said that, because I could make a comment on that too. The essence of Dasein is its existence.
Right.
Yes. Now, any of you guys who are theologically hip here, that should resonate with you, because if you asked somebody like Thomas Aquinas, how would you relate essence and existence? Of whom would you say that the essence is the existence? Well, God, right? So there is some justification for Althuis's notion that there's something deeply theological going on in Heidegger, although I think it's an important oversimplification that can't be simply let pass, right? But there's some truth to it, even terminologically. In other words, Dasein here is being described in terms that are at least analogous to God in a medieval theological sense. Now, of course, we have to be very careful because we're pre-theological. You understand what I'm saying? We're simultaneously post and pre-theological, right? We're fundamentally not dealing on the level of particular ontologies and the sciences related to them. Then the meaning of essence, concretely, if I can put it that way, and the meaning of existence will, of course, not be simply what they are in somebody like Thomas or Kant or anybody else for that matter. Okay, but there are connections. There are historical connections, right? I guess you could say in Heideggerian terms, especially because Dasein is its past. It's got to be its past in some sense here too. All right, and so existence. I think one of the very first things I pointed out some semesters ago here was that existence, certainly in the modern terms, if not always, really relates to the temporal spatial world. Right? But now time and space have taken on a very different sensibility, connotation in Heidegger than they would have, let's say, in Kant, or in Newton or somebody like that. But it's not altogether unrelated to it. That's what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so the temporality. Yeah. So being itself is temporal. This is great. If being itself is temporal, and if there is some kind of rough analogy between the Dasein whose essence is its existence and the God of theology whose essence is its existence, whereas I pointed out last time, strictly speaking in Thomas, that so-called existence is really esse, not existentia, that the being, the existence of God, the active being of God as opposed to his essence, they're identical in Thomas. They're not opposed, right? They're identical. They're one and the same. We say casually and a little bit misleadingly that therefore in Thomas the essence and the existence of God are identical. But really, strictly speaking, it's the essence and the being of God are identical, right? Where God is not a temporal spatial being. Just say he's totally immaterial, totally transcendent to the world, in that sense of the word transcendent. Whereas the analogy of the identity of essence and existence in Heidegger applied to Dasein, if I were to, this is impossible, but this is a thought project, if I read it back into theology, it would tell me that God is temporal. Do you see? And that would be, if the analogy worked without qualification, it would be as if, so if I say that Dasein here is, as it were, in the kind of role of the divine, traditional divine, you see, identity of essence and existence, except, the important qualification would be that except to the extent to which the analogy is useful, it calls to our attention what theologically the equivalent would have to be, that somehow the divine itself was temporal spatial. Now we see an anticipation of that in the philosophical tradition in pragmatism, right? Because in pragmatism, God, the creator, through the medium of time, comes to realize himself, itself, fully in the ideal end of the Peirce's cosmic goalpost, right? The God, the creator, is the absolute beginning, and God fully realized is the absolute end. And God realizes himself. This is almost Hegel. It's not quite. The difference is that God realizes himself in pers, the fuzzy Hegelian. He realizes himself in pers inextricably in and through the temporal process, in and through the process of evolution. And evolution is not a simply mechanical unfolding of an eternal actuality. It is the realization in and through time of what ideally will be an eternal reality and actuality, right? Whereas in Hegel, yes, there is time and space, but it's a charade, right? Time and space is this, the outcome is never in doubt. It's not just, as it is in pragmatism, a tendency that ideally will result in the eternal, the divine self-realization in and through the world. In Hegel, that absolute self-realization is there to begin with, and it manifests itself in its actuality in time and space. And it's very Aristotelian in a way that Peirce is not. Okay, so yes, there is something. There's a subtle analogy here in Dasein, and I think the subtle analogy to the divine in Dasein, except that the divine would have to be here by analogy temporal spatial. How do I account for that? I account for that with the tie to Kant again, because it is in Kant. Remember, Kant's the guy speaking in morality. Don't tell me what to do. I don't care if you're God. That's I can't do what you tell me to do and think I'm doing something moral because you're, even if you're divine, because it is ontologically necessary for a rational being to be autonomous. The law that I obey in Kant has to be the law of my own being, or I would be, if I put it, I don't want to confuse you, right? But you see, they're deeply related to one another. I mean, this guy, he doesn't exist without Kant, right? I can't be authentically I can't be authentically moral in Kant if I'm not following the law of my own being, my own legislation, my own creation. You see, and then on the metaphysical end of it, in the world of appearance, as I've already quoted myself quoting Kant, I am the author. I solve Hume's problem by recognizing that I am the author of my own experience. I am the creator of the world of my experience. Kant is very modest, not to make the claim that that's all there is to it. There's a noumenal world, and there may be a God, in fact, right, who has created this noumenal world. But scientifically, knowledge-wise, I don't know anything about that. I can't know anything about that. I have those ideas in my transcendental consciousness. I can't deny I have the ideas, and they serve certain regulative, useful purposes for me in doing my science. They give me a sense of order, and they give me a sense of unity, and so forth and so on, as regulative guides to organizing my experience of the world. But I have to understand, as far as the temporal spatial world of my experience goes, I am the author of it. I, meaning the transcendental ego, the Kantian transcendental ego, right? The I think. Right, is the author of his experience. Well, there's already in Kant, you see, the equivalent of what I'm saying is a kind of bringing together of the idea of creating the world with the important noumenal qualification in Kant, creating the world and being a temporal spatial, irreducibly a temporal spatial being. Right? Now, if you take that side of Kant, as it were, all right, and get rid of the reference altogether to the reference to the noumenal, right, then you've got something like phenomenology in Heidegger's sense of the word. Right? And that's beyond also Hegel, because Hegel wanted to make that noumenal appear as such in appearance. He wanted to make the absent substance manifest itself in time and in time and space, in and through the forms of time and space, temporal, right? In our experience. Heidegger doesn't want to do that because he doesn't want to import that, right? Right? So that being outside of the world is altogether within the world. Okay. We got to keep moving here. Okay, so we turn to 49 and 50. Being in the world in general as the fundamental constitution of Dasein. And then he breaks that down over on page 50. Breaks down that phrase into three moments, as it were. In the world, being in the world in general, right? So in the world, in relation to this factor on the top of page 50, 1, 2, 3, we have the task of questioning the ontological structure of world and of defining the idea of worldliness as such. And notice, when I was looking at this, I was thinking to myself, if I were going to do this, which I wouldn't presume to do, right? I'd have to go back in time. I would say, well, wait a minute. You got in the world, you break out being, and you break out being in. Why don't you break out world? In other words, notice, you could do that. You play the same word game, right? So, so the point I'm making, so 1 and 3 is in the world and being in. Okay, so I got in connected with being, I got in connected with the world. If I take one term in isolation, it's a being in the middle. I like it's in the middle. Okay. Why not world in isolation?
Well, he does do worldliness and
Yeah.
impacts just not here.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, but worldliness takes us back to the notion that we're already in a world, right?
He's already in being.
In other words, I think, I guess what I want to point to here is that the fact that he doesn't break it out here as a separate item in this particular comparison anticipates the fact that there's no world, I want to say, in which we are not. There's no world apart from, can I say, inness? Okay. All right.
The world is always there.
Huh?
The world is always there.
Yeah. Right. There's no world apart from inness.
But it works the other way too, right? Because there's no being apart from a world in which it is in.
Well, that's the question. There is an abandonment of beings by being. Being, I think it has to do with the now what I want to say, the existential in the Heideggerian sense of the word, the existential meaning of being cannot be understood apart from the nothing. So, whereas it's a kind of pure abstraction when Hegel says being and nothing are indistinguishable, when he's doing the logic and the philosophy of mind, being nothing are indistinguishable, in the first moment, they're indeterminate, right? That uncritical passing over from a Heideggerian understanding of the relationship of being and nothing, or Jim was pointing out last time in terms of what is metaphysics, the text that I was quoting in Novitas Mundi, where he gives us being crossed out. All right, so the phenomenological being, the being which is the phenomenon of phenomenology, the being the phenomenon, I would say that being as being as opposed to nothing can as it were not be in the world, and an anticipation of its not being in the world, perhaps in the sense in which we'll find it in the Beiträge, is already in its not being in the world in the sense that Dasein is initially and for the most part lost in the they. So there's a sense, again, phenomenologically, being need not be in the world, and one way in which being is not in the world is in the lostness of Dasein, to the extent to which Dasein is prone to be lost in the they, prone to be lost in everydayness, right? Then in that sense, being is not in the world in the sense in which being is in the world when Dasein comes explicitly to itself. So I think that, and notice, as we've anticipated it, it comes explicit to itself when we're going to have a here, a there, a world in which she doesn't exist. Okay. So, can being not be in the world? Well, I got news for you. If it's your being, one day it's going to occur to you, it's going to hit you, that being, the being that you are, your being in the world, that being may not be in the world anymore. And we're talking about the most radical individuation of the pure transcendence, of the being, the meaning of which we're questioning, do you see? So that radical individuation involves the question, right? In other words, I can't separate really in Heidegger's way. I don't think I should be able to separate the radical individuation of being, right, from the being, it's being. Okay? So my absence from the world is an absence from the concrete world of time and space. And that's what my friend was, I was shocked, and I said to her, I should not have said it was too casual a remark. I said, well, I don't think it's a theological question. I said, it might be a psychological question. And maybe if I was thinking more Heideggerian that afternoon, it would have been a Heideggerian question. It would have been a pre-psychological question. It would have been a pre-ontological question. Because that's what she was really feeling, right? You see? So I think that there's something to the omission, or put it more positively, something to his in effect, unmooring being from being in. There is this being and there's being in, and that means that there's possibility of a being that is not being in. Right? And that is very concrete. In other words, I want to say this is not an abstract consideration in a Heideggerian context. Right? That's the root of angst. Right?
So how is that? Yeah. Is that related then to? He starts to use.
I have to go back. I have to call her up. Yeah, go
on. His use of the word inner-worldly, which he starts to use, and
right.
I mean, so there. I mean, along this question that you're just developing here, he does speak a few pages back from where we are right now about average everydayness is not nothing. He actually refers to it as not nothing.
Right.
And so there's some kind of true confrontation with the world, in some sense, that is the confrontation with the nothing. So there's some kind of identification of world and this nothing.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following your. I don't know. I'm not sure what you're asking me.
Well, the first part of it is his use of the word inner-worldly.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Which seemed to be.
You mentioned inner-worldly beings.
Yeah.
So Dasein is not an inner-worldly being. Dasein is in the world.
Right.
Together with, or in relation to, toward inner-worldly beings.
Right. I guess part of that caught me because it seemed like it implied the possibility of there being outer-worldly beings, or things that weren't in the world.
Well, I think it goes back to my attempt to answer Adam's question. In other words, Dasein is ecstatically in the world, right? In other words, Dasein is in the world without being an inner-worldly being. It's in the world in the way of transcending the world, but not in the metaphysical sense of transcendence, right? It's ecstatically in the world. It's in the world in such a way that its transcendence to the world has never been without the world.
Right.
And that's a little pun, too. Its transcendence of the world has never been outside the world, to say, as if the world were an inner-worldly being, right? We're outside of inner-worldly beings, right? Because we're outside, it's as it were, we're outside of ourselves within the world, right? We can't be outside of the world because in a certain sense there's no outside of the world, because the world is not a being.
Right. We can go
okay.
on.
All right.
But wait,
yeah.
what was saying, because I am not sure
Okay.
how inner-worldly being is being used. I mean, I understand.
Things are inner-worldly beings.
Okay, it's nature and it's things that are not Daseins.
That's right. Not Dasein. That's
Okay.
right. Okay.
It's a strange formulation, though, I must say. But
Well, I think you could inner-worldly beings, or I think the thing is because we naturally, I think we just think in is in.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So I think one way of understanding it is that there are things that are in the world non-ecstatically, in more traditional language, they are.
They don't exist.
Okay, yeah, that was the distinction I was making last time. I was making the distinction between existence and extantness. They are there, but they don't exist in the heavily freighted Heideggerian sense of existence. That's right. They are not. They are beings for whom their being
It's
is
not
not
a question.
a question or an issue. Right? And we are beings, and so we are in the world, but we are in the world in such a way that the being itself of the being that I am is an issue, is an issue for me, or is a matter of concern.
And that is
But
its
there's no-
transcendence.
Huh?
That is its transcendence. in a
Yes,
sense.
yes, yeah. Transcendence to, yes. But most pointedly, when it comes to the question of angst, it's going to be its transcendence to nothing. It's transcendence to its own. The transcendence to its own being on the part of Dasein is incomplete, inauthentic, until Dasein realizes that its transcendence to its own being is its transcendence to its own nothingness, to its own not being. Do you see? And that's scary, right? That can be terrifying, right? So inner worldly beings, they just don't have that problem, right? But what I was thinking as I was rehearsing that in my head or getting to it, but again, another point of formal analogy with Heidegger. I don't know how else to put it. I want to be very careful here, right? But another thing about Heidegger is that he has softened, right, the wholeness of the world. You see, he's interested in the wholeness, by the way. He softened the Hegelian absolute sphere outside of which there is nothing. You see, by bringing that nothing, as it were. Now, this is a kind of linguistic game that I think has meaning. To use, I only use the term meaning with a good conscience when I'm talking about Heidegger, because there is no meaning. Okay. But the Hegelian absolute self-consciousness is that outside of which there is nothing. Now, I'm playing a little bit, but this play is meaningful. Imagine bringing the nothing inside. Do you see? So if the whole of actuality is that outside of which there is nothing in Hegel, right? You could say that Hegel has the eternal. The reason Hegel has in the Faith and Philosophy in the appendix, in that appendix called Thinking in the Third Millennium, Looking Without the Looking Glass. There's a little section in there, not insignificant section, in which I do a little rehearsal of the role of anxiety in people like Kierkegaard, who made anxiety, put anxiety on the map. Right? And then I say that Hegel, of course, banishes anxiety, and of course Heidegger brings it back. You know, the cat's out of the bag. He brings it back full blast. Okay. Well, now I just put it. I want to anticipate something fundamental in Heidegger's text here, right? The angst question and the anxiety question, and my friend's angst about her not being there or here when she ceases to be. So the possibility, my being toward death in Heideggerian terms, you see, is being toward my own non-being, but not my abstract non-being, my not being in the world. Not my not being in the world as a doorknob, okay, but not being in the world, you see, as a Dasein who is sharing, it comes up in today's context, today's reading, sharing with other Daseins, sharing being in the world with other Daseins, right? And I think he makes the point very, very clearly that we're never talking about an isolated abstract Cartesian ego or self, you see, I'm always, and it goes back to your psychologically framed point, but it's true, I'm always, I mean, the world is already there, and people are already there. I mean, I had a mother, you know, I mean, that minimally, right? There was somebody there at the beginning of my being. Whether I remember it or not is another issue which Sartre likes to play with. But it's the thrownness, you see, that there's something prior to me, my pastness there. One of the ways in which I'm past spatially is that I'm in the world with other beings. So those other beings, not just beings, other beings there, other Daseins, okay, other eyes, right? And not just the contemporary ones, but also that relates me, therefore, see, it relates me back to the previous Daseins, because none of these Daseins, these other Daseins, right? You see what I'm saying? They had uncles and aunts and cousins and progenitors philosophically and otherwise and scientifically, you see. So this thing kind of stretches out, I want to say indefinitely, both spatially and temporally. And I'm always, so in that sense, the ecstatic type, I'm always beyond myself in the sense, so I want to say, because it occurs to me to say so, I am originarily, I'm speaking in a kind of Levinasian way, I'm originarily beyond myself. You say, my being is my past. But what I would say past is a temple term. Spatially, my being is being others. See? Now, I can be others authentically and inauthentically. And when I'm others inauthentically, then I'm the they. Then I've lost my authentic being. But can I be without being with others? No. Okay. Can I be with others authentically and inauthentically? Yes. Is that a possibility constitutionally inherent in being there? Yes. Right. And that is the issue. So being there there's something at stake in being there. In the very structure of being there is an issue. There is something that matters. There's something at stake, and what is at stake, what matters, is my being there authentically, which is another way of saying, right, being related to others authentically. Yeah.
So I have a question about that, because I was surprised to hear him say, speaking of inauthentic and authentic, that being inauthentic was not a lesser form of Dasein. So in some sense, he played no value judgment on how one came to be as a Dasein, authentically or inauthentically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's... he shares with Hegel the accusation that neither of them have an ethics. So when you say value judgment, that makes me think of that. In other words...
On the other hand, he has the notion of care, which is very, very definitely a notion of ethics.
Well,
but that's not
no,
how I use it.
he makes the distinction between care, strictly speaking, I don't know what page this is on.
We don't have to...
Well, it's okay. We need to get to it anyway, sooner or later. But he makes I can do it from memory, but I'd like to find a page for you. Yeah, if you were to... This is really a jump, but we might as well do it. Just jump to 115. In the middle of page 115 of our text, right at the end of Heidegger 122. Okay. End of Heidegger 122. Actually, it's right at the beginning of 123 is what I want to look at. He says, just as circumspection belongs to taking care of things as a way of discovering things at hand, concern is guided by considerateness and tolerance. So, because what he's talking about here, the context, you recall, hopefully, is the relationship with Mitdasein, the relationship with other Daseins, the Daseins that we share being in the world with, okay? And so, to go back to your most recent question, technically speaking, care relates to things. We take care of things, and we're concerned about others in the sense of Dasein. Now, I don't want to interrupt the thrust of your question. I want you to reiterate it, but there is that distinction, right? I am concern about others. I think, now I'm trying to recall, the thrust of your question had to do with the lack of a value judgment, apparently, on inauthentic being, right? If ethics is a special science, which I think from a Heideggerian point of view would be, and that's why he doesn't pay it any mind, apparently. He's not going to get to it. But if there were an ethical implication of his understanding of concern, being the being that is concerned in its being for its being, I would want to say that it would lead us to the question of self-concern. So authentic concern would be an authentic concern for self. But the ethics that it would remind me of is like the ethics, the ultimate ethics of Aristotle. In Aristotle, there's a lot of, there are a lot of issues, but, and he certainly laid down, the first text on what it means to be virtuous, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as I think I said in another context, when you look at Aristotle's ethics very carefully, very closely, it's Achilles' ethics. It's the ethics of Achilles. In other words, yes, I am concerned for you, in Aristotle even, you see, up to the point that Achilles would be concerned with his friend Patroclus. He prefers him to everybody in the camp, but not to himself. So when push comes to shove, for Aristotle and for Heidegger, and you could say for Hegel by implication, you see, the ultimate object of ethical concern is oneself.
Kant too.
Huh? Yes, and Kant too. Yes, right. So the notion that yes, there's no value judgment placed here, but there is a more fundamental, as it were, value judgment that has already been, I want to say it's made, right? It's already, it's there, so to speak, to begin with. If you want to say, now this would be good because I want to do some sort of a critique of Heidegger. So I mean, one entrance into a critique of Heidegger would be precisely that, namely that yes, number one, there's no explicit ethics. Number two, if I were to look for some analog to an ethical position, so to speak, or an ethical assumption, the ethical assumption from Aristotle through Heidegger would be that the ultimate concern is the self, right? Self-concern, and then the only question becomes whether or not I'm authentically concerned for myself or not. It reminds me of the political terminology that I don't know whether we hear it much anymore, but enlightened self-interest. Okay, all right. So, but it would explain a lot of the Bush foreign policy as enlightened self-interest. At least in Bush's mind. I don't know whether it is enlightened, so I'm not making a judgment about that. But in other words, we're going to free the world for democracy because we understand that if we don't do that, we're not going to be able, even in principle, to put an end to the war on terror.
This is why you're falling behind.
Well, no, this is to the point. And I'm on page 114. 115. The point being that the enlightened self-interest is that yes, I relate it to others but ultimately ultimately because Dasein is self-referring. So what I was going to say, the critique would be, and that's what I mean by pointing to the fact that the question here is not getting beyond self-consciousness in the Husserlian or Heideggerian, Kantian or Hegelian sense or Cartesian sense, is not getting beyond self-reference. The self-referring. Dasein remains fundamentally self-referring, and in that sense, the nothing that is outside of the Hegelian absolute is brought into the essentia existentia, the essence existence identity of Heidegger, that nothing is brought into the world, so to speak, in our experience, as being in the world, as the negative experience, as the negative illumination of what it means to authentically be in the world. If I were to speak in ethical terms, it would be Dasein comes to take a kind of full responsibility for itself. It's the resoluteness, the openness, the giving of itself to its being in the world in an explicit, I don't know whether deliberate is the right way, but in an explicit fashion, right? If there were anything like ethics, that would be it. But that ethics is completely, ultimately, fundamentally centered on the self.
Don't you think he builds in, because of the complexity of Dasein as being in the world, as being with others, that to say that it is, I mean, I agree it comes back to the self, but what that self is always already moving towards other. I mean, there's a circularity to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem to me to ultimately rest with a kind of self as subject in any way. I mean, what Dasein is already being
not in
the
no, he makes that point in one of the footnotes, right? We're not talking about an egoistic I. That's right. We're not talking about an egoistic self, me as opposed to you in the Sartrean. Sartre develops it on that level because Sartre wants to go back onto what he would understand to be an ontological level, ontological, phenomenological level, in which the ego is ontologically, in effect, my language, at war with, or potentially at war with, or is definitely ontologically in conflict with all the other I's, all the other subjectivities, because each of them is understood by Sartre to be the center of the world, right? And therefore there is an implicit competitive relationship in Sartre. Now that doesn't apply here in that sense, because Sartre has gone back into a mode of idealism. Sartre is a kind of an idealist who thinks, yes, idealism is irreducible. We are idealists whether we like it or not. There's only one thing that Sartre wants to point out, is that the ideal that we can't get rid of is empty. Okay? But we have to understand that this empty ideal is that in terms of which we have to work out the meaning of our lives as best we can, right? So there's a kind of desperate courage there in Sartre's analysis, about your way of putting it. So the truth of what your observation would be, what reminds me, however, and I think I like it, I like to be reminded of this by you, in effect, not that you intended it, but you might have. When I go back to Kant, see, Kant's understand. What is that world of time and space? That's the world of knowledge for Kant. That's the world of science for Kant. In the broad sense of the word, in the Hegelian sense of the word, the philosophical sense of the word, and in the narrow positive sciences sense of the word, right? Because for Kant and for Hegel, I mean, there's no sharp divide between those two things. But when I look at Kant's definition of what is true in the world that we create, what is true is what is verifiable, able to be validated by, in principle, by all the others, all other, right? So if I put it in concrete terms, if you tell me you get cold fusion in Utah, okay, provisionally I'll buy it, but I'm going to check it out in Tokyo lab and the Berlin lab and so forth, and only if the scientific community can verify this, right? So you would say what? And this is the Heideggerian point more fundamentally in the scientific realm that Kant sets up. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a kind of scientific objectivity. How do I arrive at scientific objectivity? By the verification by all the individual subjects who are participating in this scientific community, or in humanity, if you want, you see? Okay. So you would say, well, that's not egoistic. Well, you're right, it isn't egoistic. Do you see? But it's profoundly subjectivistic. And that's where Heidegger's at, right? We have a subjectivity here, analogous to the Kantian subjectivity. That subjectivity is the root of what for Kant would be, and for Heidegger would be, in analogous but different ways, an authentic objectivity. As opposed to, what do I want to say? As opposed to objective presence. He wants to, and it goes back to the initial question about existential and existential. It's not that it's not, and your point last time, that it's not that we're not anticipating in Heidegger some sort of conceptualization authentic conceptualization of our experience, right? You see, but so it's not that we're leaving off. We're not going back to I don't know what. We're not going back to Heidegger. We're not going back to. So it's not Kierkegaard, but it's not Husserl either. It's not a conceptualization that somehow, in principle, distinguishes itself in a way that's not resolved from its empirical being in the world. Its existence, right? So. Semantic problem there. Okay. So the synthesis in these terms is that I have here a conceptualization that's rooted in existence. Right? I establish a continuity between the two ideas, between the ontological and the ontic. All right. Okay. I think I've just partially lost the train where I was going.
Well, you were about to criticize. You were about to offer the critique of subjectivity to.
Yeah. So the Heideggerian critique is a critique of an objective presence, not because there's no sense of objectivity here, analogous, not because there's no sense of a proper or authentic ontological concern. But that if objectivity is going to be authentic, it has to be rooted, right? It has to be grounded in the what was the subject of that sentence? If objectivity, yeah, it has to be grounded in. It has to be grounded in effect in an authentic subjectivity, which is a subjectivity that is. Related to itself in existence. I want to say immediately in existence. That an authentic objectivity that is not purchased at the price, so to speak, of its relationship to our immediate existence. So that subjectivity, a pre-consciousness subjectivity, in Heidegger is the ground for an authentic objectivity, as opposed in a way that what he calls objective presence is not. Now, linguistically, let me see, there's another place that I want to point to in the text on this point, if I can. I think it's around page 80, so we're going to have to play hopscotch with this text a little bit, it looks like. If we look on page 80, maybe we stop toward the top of the page 80, our page 80, which would be Heidegger's page 85. The next to the last paragraph at the beginning on Heidegger 85, and the first paragraph beginning on page 80. As the being of things at hand, relevance itself is always discovered only on the basis of a relevant totality previously discovered. That is, in the things at hand encountered. What we call the worldly character of things at hand thus lies pre-discovered. This totality of relevance previously discovered contains an ontological relation to the world. Letting beings be relevant and thus freeing them for a totality of relevance must have already somehow or other disclosed that for which it is freeing. That for which things at hand in the surrounding world are freed, skipping the parenthesis a moment, cannot itself be understood as a being of the kind of being thus discovered. So, Dasein is not such a being. It is essentially not discoverable if we restrict discoveredness as the term for a possibility of being of all beings, unlike Dasein. But now, what does that mean? To say that for which inner-worldly beings are initially freed must previously be disclosed. And dropping to the last sentence in that middle paragraph there, the previous disclosure of that for which the freeing of things encountered in the world ensues is none other than the understanding of world to which Dasein as a being is always already related. Previous letting something be relevant to, with, is grounded in an understanding of something letting things be relevant, and such things as the in which and the with which of relevance. These things and what underlies them such as the what for to which relevance is related, and the for sake of which, from which every what for is ultimately derived, the for sake of which is Dasein itself, right? The being of Dasein is the being for the sake of which, right? From which every what for is ultimately derived. All of these must be previously disclosed in a certain intelligibility. And what is that in which Dasein understands itself pre-ontologically as being in the world? In understanding a context of relation, Dasein has been referred to and in order to, in terms of an explicitly or inexplicitly grasped potentiality of its being for the sake of which it is, which can be authentic or inauthentic. This prefigures a what for as the possible letting something be relevant, which structurally allows for relevance to something else. Dasein is always, in each case, already referred in terms of a for the sake of which to the with what of relevance. This means that insofar as it is always, that is Dasein, is always already lets beings be encountered as things at hand. So not only is Dasein being in the world, and therefore there's no being there without a world, there's no being there that isn't already encountering beings, inner-worldly beings. Right? So that within which Dasein understands beforehand in the mode of self-reference is that for which it lets beings be encountered beforehand. As that for which one lets beings be encountered in the kind of being of relevance, the wherein of self-referential understanding is the phenomenon of world. Right? So there's no I don't know how else to say it. I mean, these are, I can't say two sides of the same coin, and I can't say polarity, right? But there is no being there that is, there is no self-referential Dasein, and no understanding of no self-referential understanding apart from the phenomenon of world, right? So Dasein is, I want to say, I think you could not say it overly strongly that for Heidegger, Dasein is worldly, right? I think that's the way to put it. As it were, so if the essence, he said very clearly, that the essence of Dasein is existence, and we've shown how for Heidegger that is temporality and spatiality in Heideggerian modes, but it's consistent with the notion of existence certainly in modern philosophy, which comes to the fore, temporal spatial being in the world, even in the Kantian sense. So now we would say, then I think I could overlay on that to make it a little more vivid. If the essence of Dasein is existence, you could equally well say the essence of Dasein is world. I don't want to say worldliness because I have a technical thing in mind. Is world.
Worldly?
Yeah, maybe I'll go. Yeah, worldly. I could. Yeah, okay. It makes better English, right? The essence of Dasein is worldly. The essence of Dasein is worldly. It's in the, as it were, in the mode of
being in the world.
Yeah, being in the world. It's kind of redundant, but
the worldhood of the world is what.
Yeah. Well, he speaks of the worldhood of the world, and he also speaks of the worldliness of the world in general. It's the title of one of the major sections here that we've skipped over. And when I was reading that, the worldliness of the world in general, and I'm thinking of Husserl. Husserl is interested in the essence of the world in general. The essence of the world in general. If I just superimpose the language of Heidegger on top of essence of the world in general, which I find as the object of the phenomenological analysis in Husserl, then I notice that what Heidegger has added to the essence of the phrase essence of the world in general, which I'm saying is authentic Husserlian language. He's added to that the worldly essence of the world in general, and the worldly essence of the world in general is Dasein, is being there. See? And that takes us back. That's what I'm calling elsewhere the synthetic moment. That's the ontological synthesis that takes place in the form of Heidegger's fundamental ontological inquiry, that inquiry about the structures, the existential structures of everydayness, the existential structures of an existential being in the world. So there, or the existential structures of an ontic being in the world. Right? So it's to deny that I can properly understand either except in relation to the other. And it's more particularly, I think it's to deny that I can understand the latter, the ontological, the existential, without its being rooted in the existential, ontic experience of the world. Now, what I wanted to point out here was that I was doing some doodling in the margin here, and related to this, just to complicate it a little further.
On page 80?
I'm still on page 80, but I'm at my margin now. Commenting, however, on the way he speaks there in the bottom paragraph on our page 80, or in the paragraph beginning in Heidegger 86, where he says in the second sentence or so, these things and what underlies them, such as the what for to which relevance is related, the for sake of which from which every what for is ultimately derived, all of these must be previously disclosed in a certain intelligibility. And what is that in which Dasein understands itself pre-ontologically as being in the world? And I thought to myself, one way of positioning Heidegger here is that what Dasein is insofar as it is a pre-ontological understanding of being in the world, insofar as I want to play around with the language here a little bit, insofar as Dasein is an understanding of being in the world pre-ontologically, it's an understanding of here's what I want to say, and it goes back to something I was saying earlier, a pre-ontological objectivity. Right? In other words, we're not abandoning in Heidegger any sense of objectivity whatsoever. Right? We don't have an absolute subjectivity, because then we would have in Heidegger the equivalent of a kind of absolute solipsism, which we don't have anywhere really in modern thought. This is exactly the thing that modern thought is concerned about. This is the thing that modern thought is anxious about. This is the thing that, in effect, Descartes is anxious about, right? Whether he's just a solipsist. Do you see? What is this? All this is all concerned whether or not his ideas represent anything real. You see? Okay. All right. So that thing is played out on many sometimes hidden levels, from Descartes through Heidegger. I was going to say through Hegel, but even through Heidegger. Do you see? Only Heidegger is a little more forthcoming about the motive that anxiety is, as that, I say motive now in a technical sense, the motor, the precipitant, the trigger that anxiety is, that motivates an authentic self-concern on the part of the being there that each of us is in a radically individuated way. You see? So I want to translate here a little bit, because I want to compare it to Levinas, because I've made this comparison before, and it's useful to me, and I hope it is to you. So if I imagine my image of Levinas that I use someplace, I may have done a handout on this somewhere along the line, but it's always operating in my mind when I'm thinking of Levinas. Levinas is and it's based in his text, but he doesn't do it geometrically exactly. If you imagine the sphere, the Hegelian sphere of self-consciousness, absolute self-consciousness, Levinas inverts. Oh, I did it. What do you call that? That cutting of those little. I can't think of the term. If you take the circle and just break it up into an arbitrary number of arcs, and then invert the arcs so that they're related to each other. That's it. Scallops. That's it. So if you take a circle of scallops, so to speak, and then imagine it imploding toward the center, that's where Levinas is at. He's taking the realm of absolute self-consciousness. He's turning it. You can imagine. It's hard to imagine turning a sphere inside out, but just try it. Don't picture it. Imagine it. Construct it in your mind, and you turn it inside out, and then it implodes. And in Levinas's case, the implosion goes not only to the center, to the nothing, but it goes through the center, back beyond the beginning of that now absolutely inverted sphere of self-consciousness. And now I'm back in a pre-ontological, not objectivity is what I'm saying that Heidegger is really doing here. That's why he keeps putting subjective in quotes. You say, if I talk this way, you say I'm being subjective. It hasn't occurred to him what I'm telling him, right? He is really being pre-ontologically objective, but pre-ontologically objective in the sense in which he means pre-ontological here, pre-scientifically, pre-particular. He's being fundamentally ontologically objective, you see, and right. Whereas Levinas is going not just to the nothing, and insisting, as Heidegger is, you see, that I'm going to be authentically there. I have to bring the nothing. I have to advert to the nothing. I have to transcend to the nothing. I have to advert to the nothing within, without going out of the. I brought the nothing in by finding it everywhere. The whole surface of the sphere, you see, by my point analogy, is nothing. The nothingness of my being is inextricably bound up with the authenticity of my being in the world. The nothingness of my being in the world and the authentic being in the world, it's the same, right? Okay, well, what I'm saying is that in Levinas, Levinas gets out of the world. He escapes. Levinas is, now I'm playing with metaphors, but I'm desperate. Levinas says in, and I quote him in Faith and Philosophy, when he's talking about his ethics, speaking of ethics, his ethics is a metaphysical ethics. He talks about that elsewhere. But he gives us an analogy, which I criticize, Levinas. His ethics is metaphysical, beyond, outside of, before, after. In his case, it's radically before the world, less than nothing. It's before the center of the sphere of the world, of the absolute of Hegel's world, self-consciousness. He speaks of that metaphorically as floating above the waters of ontology. And I say, the thinking now occurring is immersed. I don't know whether I use the word immersed, but that's the image. Immersed in the waters of ontology. It's not an alternative to the waters of ontology. Well, you could. So now, where is Heidegger? You're going to have to forgive me for this. He's water skiing. He's water skiing. He's not above the waters of ontology, and he's not about to sink himself unreservedly, you see, in the waters of ontology. He's not about to take on, I don't like the word, but the responsibility, as it were. It's not the responsibility, the imperative. I like that word. That has a lot of freight to it, which we can. He's not about to take on the imperative of creating the world of his experience, you see, in the absolute sense, in the sense in which the being of being there is not its past, and the being of being there is not coming to it out of its future. Do you see? In which where it's not a matter. See, even his resoluteness, we're eventually going to come upon. Resoluteness, that's very Cartesian in a non-Cartesian way, in a non-metaphysical way. It's foundational resolve. You see, not the resolve to do science, right? Not the restricted resolve of Descartes, but it's still resolve. It's still, in this fundamental sense, self-referring. You see? Okay. So yes, it's not a perfect metaphor, but he's on the surface of the waters of ontology in some inverted sense. And so he's neither. I mean, you could say Levinas in that sense has as it were, the courage to absent himself, I want to say temporarily, and I mean that profoundly, because when we get that diachronic as opposed to synchronic temporality in Levinas's temporality, which has no beginning and no end, which is a radical temporality, but Levinas's radical temporality prescinds from the world altogether. All right? I mean, in other words, he prescinds from being and nothing. So what's the title of Levinas's book? What's the title of it? Otherwise than being. But he doesn't mean just otherwise. Otherwise than being means not being and not being, right? That is, put another way, when he says otherwise than being, he means not being and not nothing. Okay? So now it helps us to figure out who, looking back from Levinas, looking over Levinas's shoulders. Levinas is facing us. We look who's standing behind him. Who's standing behind him is the guy who is not otherwise than being, but is positively not otherwise than being. That is to say, he's the guy for whom being and nothing are phenomenologically relevant in a way that they were not metaphysically. I was going to say, not perhaps ultimately, even phenomenologically for Husserl in Heidegger's context, right? So he's taking on my way of putting it before was he has brought the nothing into the world, as it were. He finds the nothing in the world, right? And he finds it because he has because we find it, he finds it for us intellectually, because he has, I guess, for his own anxiety, he's been brought to the point of recognizing the limitation on the whole history of philosophy. Yeah, we talk about the finite being as his starting point, but finite being, concretely speaking, one form of finite being would be what? Would be the history of philosophy. I mean, finite being, is doorknobs, it's Daseins, it's psychology, it's history of philosophy, it's thinking. All these are concrete, phenomenal forms of finite being. And so if I take that seriously, then I have to see that there is a limit. I want a serious limit now, you see? It's not an abstract limit. What is the intrinsic limit when I think of the history of philosophy, or when I think in his terms of the history of being? Okay? If being is finite, then the history of being must be finite, and the thinking of the history of being must be finite in this concrete existential and existential way. All right, and therefore, once the mere fact that is called to my attention, I'm already beyond it. Do you see? I'm already, right? But I'm not beyond it in the way that that Levinas is. In other words, I'm not beyond it in the way of extricating myself. I was saying, even temporarily, even qua temporality, from the world. Right? I don't extricate. I remain within the world in transcending to the nothing. And well, if I'm going to remain within the world and transcend to the nothing, and that's going to be the root of the anxiety which wakes me up, right? Well, and I'm not going out of the world to transcend to the nothing. Then the nothing must be something that I advert to within the world, right? I must be now looking at the nothingness of the world, which is the nothingness of my own being.
But it wakes you up to the real world, not just to the nothing. Because then,
yeah.
I mean, and that's where I think maybe if he's water skiing, the skis and the feet are submerged at least a little. He's like dragging his feet in the waters of ontology, because it's not just merely that he's saying there's. There's
always friction.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, he's water skiing.
If you're water skiing, there's friction. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Levinas is the hovercraft.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
But there's contact with ontology here. I mean, there's a lot of contact with ontology.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not submersion.
Oh, yeah, no. Because he couldn't be moving along if he wasn't somehow he's floating. Levinas is, this is Levinas' language. He's floating above the waters of ontology.
Right.
Heidegger is floating on the waters, and you can't. I mean, you have to be in touch with them. Right? It's not saying.
Yes.
I didn't mean. What did I say? Skiing over.
You said water skiing. I just wanted to make sure that because there's this whole thing is constantly. He's not just saying we recognize the nothing and end of story.
No.
So much the real, actual world.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah. No. I didn't mean. Well, you have to understand. The thinking now occurring doesn't think that superficial is not real.
Right.
Okay. And so what I'm saying is that maybe in a certain sense he's not superficial enough. But I take your point. I didn't mean superficial in the negative everyday sense of the word. In other words, he's on the surface of the waters of ontology, but he's on it. He's in touch with it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he would not be, in that sense, the waters are buoying him up. But the waters are buoying him up, if you go back to this analogy ad nauseam, right? If you're skiing, or even if you're driving a boat over the water, you don't have to be water skiing, or jet skiing. That's one of my sons used to like to do. If you're going over the water, it's it's almost there's a certain analogy to flying here. I mean, in other words, the contact with the water is what keeps you up. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a power. Just as a plane flying, right? Its movement sustains it, right? In other words, it's really the friction. It's the if there were no, how would it stay up? Well, if there were gravity and no air, it would crash. We can make a spaceship go up there and stand there, or a satellite. We can position a satellite because we've got it at a point where we've neutralized gravity, and therefore we don't need wind to sustain it. Right? You know what I'm saying? Okay.
That's Derry.
Okay. Well, all right. Okay. Okay. So yes, he's definitely in contact with the waters of ontology. That's correct. And maybe he's more in contact with the waters, and he means to be, and that's maybe more of the work feel that you get in Heidegger than you would get, I think, in Levinas. You get a suffering feeling in Levinas. You're supposed to. You're oppressed, because that's his picture of a pre-ontological subjectivity. Is oppressed, persecuted. That's his language, Levinas. Right? Now, this has a positive meaning, ultimately, presumably, by way of a critique of the world, self-consciousness, consciousness, and so forth and so on. In Heidegger, I don't think we get a sense of oppression, but we do get a sense of construction, anticipation, some kind of hope. I guess you could say, fairly in Heideggerian terms, some kind of hope. I was going to say for the future, but it's probably a hope coming perhaps from the future, right? Sustaining us if we're resolutely and authentically positioning ourselves, sustaining us in this, what he will call later on the crossing, right? In this time between the first and the second beginnings, right? So there is
I think in this text,
huh?
he thinks he's there. I don't feel the anticipation, at least not yet.
Okay. Well, this is relatively early.
Yeah.
So
But
okay.
I think he thinks he's underwater. I mean, I think he thinks.
Well,
he's
you have to be
actually
careful. In today's
discovered-
assignment, he says Dasein is always, doesn't say underwater. He says is always skiing. His language is always underway. Always underway. So I don't think he thinks he's arrived even here. He's not stressing this. In other words, this is I would say probably relative to what we'll see in the Beiträge. This is a relatively technical investigation.
Yeah.
The Beiträge is kind of a big picture book, I think, even though ironically it's a lot of fragments, or what look like fragments. So here you have a very continuous work, but it's really kind of technically focused, I would say, as much as you can speak of a technical focus in a work that's implicitly critical of technique, in a certain sense. Okay. All right, now. Let's see, we went back to 80. All right, so I think I've made that point. And imagistically, he goes back to the center of the circle in such a way that it can be immediately recognized that every point, as it were, on the circumference of the circle is equally nothing. And you could say every point on the plane, the area of the circle, it's inseparably nothing. I don't mean it's just nothing, okay? But the world in which we are, the being in the world, into that he has brought, in a thoroughgoing way, the nothing that Hegel has excluded from it. And so in Hegel, there's no anxiety. You could say in Hegel you have absolute self-assurance. Right? And you see, this has practical consequences. Marx, who was an inside-out Hegelian, a good materialistic idealist, is absolutely self-assured. He has no doubt about the ultimate outcome of history. Do you see? Okay. So Hegel represents an absolute self-assurance. When I bring the nothing into the world, make it something found in the world, I don't reduce the world absolutely to nothing. I'm not yet Altizer, right? I'm not. I don't reduce the world to a kind of actual nothingness, as Altizer calls it in his Death of God theology, right? But I make it an irreducible ingredient, an irreducible. I call to attention that I cannot have the being of the world without what I'm calling adverting or transcending to the nothing or the nothingness of that very being. Or in Hegelian terms, that's just another way of saying, it's a more dramatic way of saying the finitude of the being of the world, right? And that's it. The finitude of the being of the world is what we begin with. The finitude of the world of appearance, the finitude of what otherwise would be the infinite universal in Hegel. Here, the universal is finite, right? It's a finite universal with which I begin, all right? It's already the being that determines beings, that determines the being of beings. It's inherently or intrinsically that being, right? So it's intrinsically the being of beings, as we were saying, I think last time and probably again this time, in effect. The being of beings is not something beyond the beings, right? Or certainly not something behind those beings, and probably not even beyond the beings, except in the mode of. I want to qualify that by saying, except perhaps in the mode of the ecstatic temporality that constitutes Dasein. So in that sense, the Dasein is distinguished from the beings that are not Dasein. Okay, so there the negativity, the nothingness comes into play there in a way that's not. So you say, well, you could say in Hegel there is a negativity as an intrinsic part of the dialectic, right? But the negativity is overcome in Hegel. In other words, it's only temporarily there. But in Heidegger, only temporarily is all there is. You see, there is no eternal actuality in the Hegelian sense that right? The wasness, the pastness, the priority, the perfect tense of the what it was to be of Aristotle. For Heidegger, that pastness is that's all there is of essence is temporal. If being is temporal, then essence. The essence of Dasein is existence. The essence of Dasein is temporality and spatiality. The essence of Dasein is worldly. Is worldly. It's a worldly essence. And there ain't close my thought. There ain't no other essence for Heidegger. Right? There is no. So what I was going to say was that we could say, well, in Hegel there's a dialectic, and therefore there's a negativity, and there's some kind of nothing. Do you see? But the proof that there's nothing outside of the absolute idea in Hegel, the proof of it is that whatever strikes one as nothing in Hegel, right, has only an ideal presence. It's only there to be negated. It's the double negation, right? He negates that whatever nothingness would appear to be there as just that, mere appearance, having no truth of its own. That is its nothingness, right? The finite has no truth of its own, right? Whereas here the finite has substance. It has a truth of its own, but the truth and the substance of the of what otherwise would be the Hegelian world of appearances or the Kantian temporal spatial world is not an infinite truth. You see, it's a finite truth. So the finite, as such, has a truth of its own in Heidegger that it can't have in Hegel. And okay, I'll stop on that point because I want to move on if that's possible. Okay. The worldliness of the world. Okay. Let's turn to back a little bit to page 100, because there's another place where we can, again, I think, position Heidegger, hopefully. On this page, there's a footnote with an asterisk that Heidegger's comment. I'm looking for the asterisk in the text. Oh, there it is. It's in the bottom of page 101. It's in Heidegger's 109, toward the bottom of Heidegger 109, toward the bottom of 101 of our text. He says, let us assume that I enter a familiar but dark room which has been rearranged during my absence in such a way that everything which was on the right-hand side is now on the left-hand side. If I am to get oriented, the mere feeling of the difference between my two sides does not help at all, as long as I do not apprehend some particular object whose position, as Kant casually remarks, I have in mind. But what else does this mean except that I necessarily orient myself in and from already being in a familiar world? Right? The context of useful things in a world must already be given to Dasein. So the context is there to begin with. The structure of the world, so to speak, is there to begin with. The world is already ordered. So again, as opposed to the thinking now occurring, when I say the thinking now occurring, the ego is creating the actual world. It's not simply there to begin with, right? So in Heidegger, on the contrary, the world is already there to begin with. The context is already there. The I is not intelligible apart from or intelligible to itself. It cannot understand itself as ever being. I was going to say ever being in a Hegelian sense outside of the world. And you say, well, wait a minute, thinking now occurring, you must think you can get outside of the world. No. In the thinking now occurring, there's no inside and outside. There need not be an inside and outside, because in the absolute now, what I have is the beginning of existence. Do you see? So there's no context, pre-existing context within which I am. Doesn't mean I'm outside of a context in the Levinasian sense. Do you see? Because in the absolute now of existence, there is no inside and outside. That's what I meant by the absolute superficiality. Okay, so that's the way in which the I in the thinking now occurring can be understood to create the world newly. I could put it that way, since we're doing worldly, to newly create the world absolutely now. All right, but back to Heidegger. But for Heidegger, that's not the case, right? So the context, the world is always there already, and therefore the world is always familiar. Now, what I wanted to do here was to show this. Again, I'm taking the liberty of wresting from Heidegger's text some historical context here. So he says in the footnote on familiar world, from a familiar belongingness that I hold before myself and vary accordingly. Well, gee, that's tipping his hat to Husserl. All right? Except that, what does Husserl do? He doesn't take the familiar world, familiar belongingness, right, and vary it, right? He takes any number of possible ways of belonging, any number of possible worlds, any number of possible hats, and he Husserl considers all the variable types of. You have a world with 13 billion stars. You can have a world with 2 stars. What is the essence of world, right? So Husserl starts with what? An examination of in principle now, all the possible particular worlds you could imagine. And what is it, when I run through that, it's a kind of Leibnizian move. You see why Heidegger's not going to be happy with him? That's the way God creates the world, and Husserl is creating his phenomenological essence by doing the same thing, a kind of a review of in principle, all the infinite possible worlds you could possibly have, and find out what do they have in common, and that's the essence of a world in general for Husserl. So Husserl begins in principle, qua possibility now, with the particulars. Just as Leibniz, God begins with all the possible essences that have a claim to exist. And they're all quite particular when you stop and think about it. Do you see? And Husserl moves from particularity to the universal general essence. But what is Heidegger doing? He's turning him inside out, or he's reversing the direction. Now, we know in philosophy, by the way, when you turn something inside out and reverse the direction, you got a whole new ballgame. It's just not your raincoat turned inside out, okay? It's another world. So he turns him inside out. What do I mean by that? He starts with the world as a given, as familiar, with belongingness. He's in the world as belonging to the world and things belonging. Okay? And he starts with that, and then he varies that. That is, he looks at he goes from the universal. What I want to say, if I put it in Hegelian terms, just to make a context for it, he goes from the universal, which now have become the general, familiar belongingness to the world, to what, in more sharp terms, would be the specification of that. Right. So it's because I'm already, in general, in a structured world that I am able to arrive at the particular differences. I notice when you rearrange my room in my absence, all right, what you've done, you've made another. There was one particular there before, and now there's another particular. But I can only distinguish one particular from another particular arrangement of my room if I have a general familiarity with belongingness. You see, so I start with this generality, all right, which is, I want to say, is, for Heidegger, in his own way, generative, do you see, of the understanding of the particular. Right? And so that's another way of saying what he said much more abstractly, that the being of things is the being that determines the being of things. Right? In other words, it is already, this finite being already is, it's finite is, see, this is what's close to what I call the transcendental essence of existence, or what I say in the Thinking Now Occurring in the Morality Seminar, in effect, that there is no genus whatsoever in the Thinking Now Occurring. If I'm creating the world absolutely now, I need a genus for it. It would be a drag. It would be a distraction. It would be a throwback. It would be living in the past. Right? So Heidegger's going in that direction. I've got a being which is the pure transcendent, pure and simple transcendent. Right? It's the transcendental truth, which is the ground and effect of a radical individuation now. Okay, but that individuation, as opposed to the absolute particularity, includes in itself, implicitly, you see, this kind of distancing and de-distancing and spatialization and temporalization, this ecstatic pastness and being from the future and so forth, that the Thinking Now Occurring does not involve. Okay. Okay, so he starts from the universal and arrives. In effect, logically speaking, he would start from the universal and arrive at the particular. He starts from the familiar as already there. The context is already there. And so the point I want to stress is that the being that Heidegger is focused on from the get-go, that is not a part of a dialectical process in which nothingness is excluded from actuality. See? The actual world of Heidegger, in fact, he says it someplace, so I'm not going to find it this quickly. The actual world of Heidegger, we arrive at when we're struck by it. He has an expression.
It's page 99.
Yeah.
Oh, you got the page? What is it?
Top of 99, when it strikes one.
Oh, yeah. It's nice, right? And objectively, at the bottom of the previous page, we're in Heidegger 106, about the middle. An objectively long path could be shorter than an objectively much shorter path, which is perhaps an onerous one, and strikes one as infinitely long. When it strikes one thus, however, the actual world is first truly at hand. Okay? So, this is what I want to emphasize. So in other words, he's good. See, people say, sometimes they say to me, "What what you mean by essence is not what loving is? Why don't you use a different word?" That's like saying to Heidegger, "Why do you use the word substance? Why do you use the word actual world? You're just confusing me." No. He's saying the so-called actual world of the tradition is a pseudo-actuality. It's an imposed actuality. The world that's really actual, and even really you have to parse that one too, right? The actual world is the world. So what I want to get back to is what I was saying earlier in a slightly different context. The world in which we be is the actual world. It is the substantial world. But now, of course, actual and substantial, to say, have taken on now a more fundamentally ontological meaning, but they've taken on a fundamentally ontological meaning, means that they have an existentiality about them, which is another way of saying they have a coherent structure to them, and in that sense, which I take you to have anticipated, therefore, in a comment you made last time, that in a sense, not in the traditional sense, they have a conceptuality about them. They have a conceptual being that we are in the process, or we're in the in the process of working out, attempting to work out. Okay, we pushed the clock. I'm going to stop. I think we're not covering all the little details, which I think is probably impossible, but I think we're getting a good deal of what I wanted. Oh, the one, as we're closing our books, I just want to say one comment about the Finlichkeit, what they translate as attunement here, situatedness. Stambau translated as attunement, which is not much different from the German for mood. mood idea, moodiness or whatever. Whereas I think the literal meaning in German, as I understand it, is situatedness. That would be the more common everyday meaning of it. And I think that's helpful. In other words, another way of understanding what Heidegger is saying is that Dasein, fundamental to its constitution, is situatedness, all right? Which is a more, and I think it's translated as attunement here because there are German phrases, because one of its meanings in German would be to, as a verb, is to fare, and I think it's in certain colloquialisms which Voltraut could help us out with the German equivalent of how's it going, how are you, the fiend idea in there, the finding. How do you find yourself? So if I say, how goes it, we say in English, right? And the faring, going along, traveling, right? How's it going? And when I ask you that question, how are you? Or how's it going? What do I want you to tell me? I want you to tell me, you want you to give me an objective catalog of what's going on in your life? No. I mean, how do you feel? How are things, how do you feel in wherever you're at? You know? And that's what he's pointing to in the notion of atonement, right? That Dasein is always situated. It always finds itself. It's always finding itself, already, by the way, finding itself one way or another. And so what he says about when he specializes attunement as mood, he makes the point that we're never without a mood. We're never without an orientation in the world, whether it's calm, excited, fearful, anxious, bored, whatever it is. We're always situated in a certain way in the world. Okay, I just wanted to get that out to meditate on that, and we'll maybe pick up that and go on to the next assignment the next time.